The truck's tires spun uselessly on the icy road, the storm outside relentless. But it wasn't the blizzard that made Mason's heart race. It was Silver, his loyal dog now trembling beside him. For the first time, the German Shepherd didn't bark at the wind or howl at the cold. He whined low and desperate, his ears flat against his head, staring at something Mason couldn't see. Mason turned, following Silver's gaze, to an antique portrait hanging in the hallway of Caldwell Manor. The eyes of the painted senator seemed to follow them. Then Silver did something Mason never expected. He backed away, whimpering in pain, as if something invisible was tearing at him. Mason swallowed hard. Something was behind that wall. And it wasn't just the storm. Mason pulled the truck to a halt in front of Caldwell Manor, the old tires crunching in the fresh layer of snow. The storm was a full-force assault, now blizzard winds cutting through the air sleet, pelting the truck in sheets. Inside, the heat from the engine barely cut through the chill. He glanced at Silver, who sat motionless, staring at the same spot, a portrait of Senator Arthur Caldwell, that hung above the grand fireplace. The dog's breath came in shallow, strained gasps. It wasn't just the storm that had unsettled Silver. No, it was something inside the walls. The air felt heavier in the truck, now thick with a strange, suffocating energy Mason couldn't shake. He'd been a soldier for most of his life, but this wasn't something you could fight with a rifle or an engineering tool. Silver, normally calm and stoic, suddenly whined a sharp, painful sound. His claws clicked against the dashboard, then pawed at his own head, trying to escape an invisible torment. "What is it, boy?" Mason whispered. The answer was as clear as it was terrifying. The storm wasn't the only thing raging tonight. Something was alive in this house, and it had noticed them. The cold, damp air hit Mason as soon as he opened the truck door. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing at his jacket, the sleet slicing against his face. Silver whined from the passenger seat, shifting restlessly as Mason moved around the truck to lift him out. The German Shepherd's legs wobbled under him, stiff with arthritis, but he braced himself against Mason's chest, leaning heavily as Mason carried him up the stone steps of the manor. Mason paused just inside the massive oak door, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. The manor felt hollow like a tomb, the silence almost deafening. He let Silver down onto the rug by the door, the dog's paws slipping slightly on the polished marble floor. Silver grumbled low in his throat, eyes darting toward the far end of the foyer where a massive oil painting of Senator Arthur Caldwell hung framed in gold. Mason turned to the small kitchen area to the left, intending to get Silver settled into the caretaker's quarters, but the dog wasn't following him. He looked back. Silver stood motionless in front of the portrait ears, flat eyes locked on the painted face of the senator. His body was rigid and his tail was tucked between his legs. "Easy, Silver. Let's get you comfy," Mason murmured, but the dog didn't respond. Mason felt a pang of unease, a slight tightening in his chest. This was too much like the old days, like when Silver would freeze, sensing danger before anyone else. The instinct that had saved Mason's life more than once. Silver took a step forward, dragging his hindquarters slightly. His eyes never left the painting, and then just as Mason started to walk over, the dog whined again, a sharp, strangled sound that sent a cold ripple down Mason's spine. "Come on, boy." "It's nothing," Mason said, his voice low, trying to reassure them both. Silver dropped his head to the floor, his front paws digging into the rug as he scratched at his ears, frantic like something was buried inside them. Mason's eyes narrowed. The dog had never acted this way, not even after the worst of their missions when the air had been thick with danger. This was different. He stepped closer, shining his flashlight on the wall behind the portrait, but the beam revealed nothing, just the cream-colored plaster and the gilded frame. His scanner, which had been calibrated to detect any unusual electronic frequencies, showed no signs of interference. Nothing to explain Silver's distress. Mason's mind raced as he scanned the room. No, this wasn't a glitch in his equipment. The dog wasn't reacting to a malfunction. This was something else, something only Silver could sense. Silver took another few steps toward the painting, then froze, his body trembling. He raised a paw to his ear again, like something invisible was gnawing at him. It was the kind of movement that Mason had seen before when Silver was trying to dislodge an insect, a foreign presence he couldn't understand. But this wasn't a bug, and it wasn't a draft. Mason dropped to his knees beside the dog, gently touching Silver's shoulder. "What's wrong, boy?" Silver couldn't answer, but the look in his eyes told Mason everything he needed to know. This wasn't just an ordinary house. There was something behind the walls, something making Silver hurt. A sharp, cold shiver ran down Mason's spine, and he found himself standing, moving back toward the painting. He ran his hand along the smooth surface of the gilded frame and then the wall behind it. His fingers brushed over the edge, feeling for anything out of the ordinary. Nothing. Mason cursed under his breath. He had hoped this would be a quiet job, a simple job to pay for Silver's surgery. a quiet winter to rest, to recover. But now, as the dog's whine turned to a growl deep in his chest, Mason realized something was wrong. Something had been wrong the moment he stepped inside Caldwell Manor. And it wasn't just Silver. He felt it in his gut, a pressure like the house itself was holding its breath, like the walls were watching them, listening. "All right," Silver Mason muttered, his fingers still tracing the cold plaster. "Let's find out what's going on." He turned back to the dog, whose body was tense, ears pinned to his head, his eyes wide and pleading. Silver's whimpering stopped, but the sense of unease was palpable, suffocating as if the air itself had thickened around them. Mason couldn't shake the feeling that something old was awakening. Mason reached into his jacket pocket for his scanner. He powered it up, then turned back toward the wall, the beam of light illuminating the area behind the portrait. The digital display blinked on, showing nothing, no signal, no hidden devices. Nothing. Mason frowned. He had seen this before in the field. His equipment, his tools, always gave him the truth. But in that moment, with Silver at his side, he knew that the truth wasn't what the machine was telling him. Silver let out a low growl again, his body trembling. The air seemed to hum with an invisible energy pressing down on Mason's chest. Mason dropped to his knees again, this time positioning himself closer to Silver, who had retreated slightly, backing away from the wall. Mason placed a hand on the dog's shoulder, trying to calm him, but the whine that escaped Silver's throat was pitiful, strained. "Stay with me, buddy," Mason whispered, his voice cracking. He looked down at Silver, the loyal companion who had followed him through years of war and hardship. The bond between them was forged in fire, but tonight it was being tested. Mason stood again, moving back toward the wall, hands pressing against the surface. The house was still, silent, but Mason knew something was hiding behind it. He could feel it in his bones. He stepped back, his mind already working through the possibilities. Someone had built this house, had designed it, had hidden something here. Something valuable, something dangerous. And whatever it was driving Silver mad. "All right," Mason muttered under his breath. "Let's see what's behind that wall." He moved quickly, unstrapping the flashlight from his belt and shining it around the room. The beam caught the edges of the portrait, the corners of the wall. A shadow flitted across the floor as the light flickered over something near the edge of the painting. But before he could move forward, Silver whined again, louder this time, and more desperate. Mason turned back to the dog. "Easy, Silver," he said, but the dog wasn't listening. Silver's eyes were wide with terror, and Mason could see it, the deep, primal fear that only came when something truly dangerous was near, something invisible, something deadly. Mason's heart pounded in his chest. He was no longer just here to take care of the dog. He was already in the middle of something far worse than a simple caretaker's job. And the only thing he could trust in this house besides the dog was his gut. Something was watching. Something was waiting. And Mason had no choice but to find it. As Mason stood in the room, the air thick with tension, the walls seemed to close in on him. He could feel the eyes of the house on him, and in that moment he knew the truth. Tonight his quiet winter had ended before it had even begun. Mason's fingers gripped the edges of the frame with a deliberate intensity. His breath came in shallow bursts, his mind racing as he examined every corner of the room. Silver's anxious whines echoed in his ears, pulling him away from the swirl of thoughts flooding his brain. There had to be something. The scanner was a high-grade model, reliable design for detecting any anomalies, yet here it showed nothing. The deep instinctual part of Mason's mind told him to keep searching, that Silver wouldn't be this distressed for no reason. The dog's instincts had saved them both too many times for him to dismiss it now. The sound of Silver's low growl broke through his thoughts. Mason turned toward him, but Silver had stopped growling. The dog was still staring intently at the painting of Senator Caldwell. His body was trembling, but not with fear, he was in pain. The agony was palpable in his every movement, every flinch. Mason's pulse quickened, and a sharp pang of guilt struck him in the chest. He had taken this job to give Silver a quiet life, to give the old dog the peace he deserved after years of hard service. But this place, Caldwell Manor, was not going to be the refuge they needed. It was becoming clear that it was anything but safe. "All right, buddy, let's get this over with," Mason murmured, his voice hoarse. He had no other choice but to trust his instincts, Silver's and his own. Mason stepped toward the portrait, hesitating for a moment as he stood directly in front of it. The eyes of the senator were cold, accusing. The painting seemed to follow him as he moved around it, scrutinizing every inch of the wall behind it. He placed his hand against the cool plaster, feeling for anything that seemed out of place. There was nothing, no cracks, no indentations, nothing that would explain Silver's behavior. But then he felt it. A soft, almost imperceptible hum beneath his fingertips. The walls, the plaster, everything was still, and yet something was shifting just behind them. It was like an invisible current flowing through the house, a faint vibration that had been there all along but had been masked by the storm outside. Silver whined again, louder this time, more urgent. Mason's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't imagining it. The house was alive with something Silver was picking up on, but Mason had yet to fully comprehend. Mason pulled back from the wall, looking around the room. The entire space felt different now, charged with something that wasn't quite right. The air felt heavier, like the house was holding its breath, waiting. He looked down at Silver. The dog's eyes were wide, his fur bristling, as if the very air itself was biting at him. Okay, Mason muttered, pushing up the sleeves of his jacket. Let's figure this out. Mason pulled the scanner back out of his bag, but before he could activate it, something caught his eye, a glimmer of metal in the corner of the room. He wasn't sure how he missed it before, but now, as the light from his flashlight caught the gleam, it became apparent. There, just under the edge of the carpet, was a small metal plate. Mason crouched down, pushing aside the rug to reveal a hidden hatch, a small trapdoor that blended so seamlessly into the floor it was nearly invisible. A surge of dread settled in his gut, but he couldn't ignore it. This was it, the hidden part of the manor that Silver had been reacting to. Mason's hand hovered over the hatch, the weight of his decision heavy in his chest. He could feel Silver's eyes on him, pleading with him not to open it, not to dig deeper into the unknown. But Mason had no choice. He had to protect his friend. He pried open the hatch with a grunt, revealing a narrow staircase that led downward into a dark, dusty cellar. The scent of stale air and something metallic hit him like a physical force. Silver growled low, a deep guttural sound that made the hairs on the back of Mason's neck stand up. He had heard that growl before. It was the same one Silver had given when they were clearing a collapsed building years ago, when they had found something buried, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Mason glanced down at Silver, who was now visibly agitated. The dog was trembling, his legs shaking as he stared down into the hole, his body taut as a bowstring. "I'm going," Mason said softly, his voice steady but his heart pounding. He wasn't sure if he was reassuring Silver or himself. The storm outside howled louder, as if pushing him toward that dark unknown. Mason grabbed the flashlight and descended into the cold, the beam flickering across the damp stone walls. He could hear Silver's claws clicking softly on the floor above his presence, a constant reminder of the bond they shared. The cellar was cramped, filled with the smell of mildew and decay. The air was thick with dust. Mason's footsteps echoed off the stone walls as he moved deeper, his heart hammering in his chest. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, as though the house had been waiting for him to uncover its secrets. He rounded a corner, and then he saw it. A large, rusted metal door at the far end of the room, half hidden behind old crates and piles of forgotten furniture. The door was imposing, almost like a vault, and the air around it was dense, as if something was alive in that space. Mason stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached for the door's handle. He hadn't expected to find this. The manor was supposed to be empty, abandoned, but this was something different. Silver's whine echoed through the air, sending a chill up Mason's spine. He reached for the handle and turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room beyond a room filled with strange equipment. Old military-grade machinery, wires tangled across the floor, and a large metal cabinet in the corner. But it wasn't the equipment that caught Mason's attention. It was the faint humming sound that was coming from behind the cabinet, a sound that was eerily similar to the one he had felt earlier behind the walls of the library. Mason stepped inside, feeling the weight of the room close in on him. He knew with a sickening certainty that this was what had been tormenting Silver. This was the source of the pain. His flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the room as he slowly made his way to the cabinet. His pulse raced and every instinct in him screamed to leave to get out. But he couldn't, not when Silver was still suffering. He reached for the cabinet door, pulling it open with a sharp yank. The machinery inside was old, but still active, beeping softly, lights flickering. It was a frequency generator, a device designed to send out signals. And judging by the wires connected to it, those signals were being sent somewhere, and perhaps into the walls of the manor. Mason's stomach churned as the realization hit him. Whoever had built this house had done more than hide their secrets. They had embedded them into the very bones of Caldwell Manor. Mason turned back toward the stairs, his thoughts a whirlwind. He had no idea who had built this or why. But one thing was clear: whoever they were, they didn't want anyone to find out, and they were willing to hurt Silver and anyone else who came too close to keep their secrets buried. Mason's eyes narrowed as he made his way back up to the trapdoor, his mind already spinning with plans. He couldn't just tear the place apart. There was something bigger at play here. As he reached the top of the stairs, he could feel the shift in the air, an oppressive presence watching him from every corner of the manor. "Come on, Silver," he muttered, heading back toward the main floor. "We're not done here yet." The storm outside had escalated to a fury, but inside, something darker was waiting for them both. The door slammed shut behind Mason, the cold silence swallowing him whole. There was no going back now. The house had secrets, and they would be dragged into the light whether the house or its ghosts liked it or not. Mason's pulse quickened as he moved back into the library. The cold, oppressive air seemed to press in from all sides. The hum from behind the walls still lingered in his ears, a low drone that wouldn't leave no matter how far he walked. Silver moved with him, though slower now, his body stiff from the arthritis and the toll of their earlier search. The dog's amber eyes were alert, scanning the shadows in the corners, always watching, always waiting. He stood in front of the massive portrait of Senator Arthur Caldwell, its dark eyes still seeming to follow him with an accusing gaze. The faint hum was louder now, almost like the house itself was breathing. Mason's eyes darted to the wall behind the painting. He'd measured it earlier and something wasn't right. The layout of the house didn't add up. The wall was too thick, there was a hidden space. A void. Silver whined again, the sound laced with pain, but it wasn't the usual kind of distress Mason had heard before. This was something deeper. Silver wasn't reacting to a normal threat. This was more than just a sound. This was wrong. Mason moved closer to the wall, feeling the vibrations intensify as his hand neared the spot where the portrait hung. He reached out his fingers, brushing against the frame. There was no visible indication that anything was hidden behind it, but the sensation was undeniable. The house was hiding something. A chill ran through Mason's body, and the memories came flooding back, flashbacks from a time long past. He closed his eyes, letting them wash over him. Flashback. The desert 1985. Mason was younger, then sharper. He had been a sergeant, confident, surrounded by men he trusted. They were clearing a route through a desolate stretch of land in the Middle East, a place where the sun scorched the earth and the air shimmered with heat. His squad had stopped to sweep for mines, and they were relying on the most advanced mine detector the Army had, sleek, state-of-the-art technology that promised safety. But Duke the Spaniel was different. The dog had a nose that never lied, an instinct that had saved their lives countless times. Mason remembered Duke sitting down stubbornly right in the middle of the road, refusing to move despite the clear green light on the mine detector. The rest of the team was impatient, the heat unbearable, but Duke wouldn't budge. He barked sharply, looking up at Mason with pleading eyes. Mason had been frustrated. The scanner said the path was clear. The metal detector was reliable. He didn't have time to waste. The convoy was waiting. He grabbed Duke's collar, pulling him to the side, signaling the team to advance. Mason could still hear the explosion in his mind. The ground had rocked beneath them, and the sky had filled with dust. He had heard the screams of his men, felt the searing heat as the blast ripped through the convoy. The mine hadn't been detectable by the scanner. It was a type of device that wasn't magnetic. But Duke had known. Duke had smelled it. Mason had ignored the dog's warning. He could still hear the silence that followed. The screams had faded the air, filled only with the distant crackle of radio static. The guilt of losing men because he trusted technology over the loyalty of his partner. End of flashback. Mason's eyes snapped open, the memory still sharp in his mind. The guilt from that day, the decision that cost lives, was still with him. He had learned the hard way not to trust machines over his instincts, and now, standing in the library of Caldwell Manor, he was about to make the same mistake. He had trusted the scanner, but Silver was warning him again. Silver's whine cut through his thoughts sharper this time. The dog backed away from the wall, his eyes filled with terror, the fear radiating from him palpable. Mason knelt down, placing a hand on Silver's trembling shoulder. "I'm sorry, buddy," Mason whispered. "I should have known better." He turned back to the wall, the flickering flashlight illuminating the cream-colored plaster and gilded frame. The scanner hadn't picked up anything but his instincts. Silver's instincts had led them here. Mason had learned from the past. He wasn't going to make that mistake again. Mason stepped forward, inspecting the wall with renewed intensity. There had to be a way in. He traced the outline of the frame, feeling for any seams or inconsistencies. His fingers brushed over the cold surface until they hit a small, barely noticeable indentation. He pressed harder, and with a low groaning sound, the wall shifted. Mason stumbled back, heart racing. The wall had moved, revealing a hidden alcove. The air inside the small space was thick with dust, and the faint hum from earlier seemed to resonate from the shadows beyond. He stepped into the alcove, flashlight sweeping over the strange machinery hidden in the corner. It was old, vintage even, but unmistakably military grade. Wires ran in all directions, some connected to devices Mason couldn't identify. The hum grew louder as he moved closer, the noise vibrating through the floorboards beneath his boots. This wasn't just a room. It was a command center, a hidden operation buried within the walls of the manor. And it wasn't just here to collect dust. Silver moved behind him, still limping, but there was something different in his stance now. The dog's eyes locked onto the machinery, ears flat against his skull. Mason's heart sank. He hadn't been wrong. Silver had been right all along. This wasn't a house. This wasn't just an old man's legacy. This was a trap. A machine designed to capture something or someone. The walls of Caldwell Manor were filled with secrets, and now Mason was about to uncover them all. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized just how deep the rabbit hole went. There was no turning back now. "Let's see what you've been hiding," Mason muttered to the empty room. He felt the weight of his past decisions heavy on his shoulders. The house had been watching them. It had been watching him for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. Mason reached for the exposed cables, fingers trembling slightly. He didn't know what he was dealing with yet, but he would find out. He had to. For Silver. For the ghosts of the past that still haunted him. The hum in the air grew louder, and Mason couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The moment the cables were touched, the hum shifted. A different noise rose, one that made Mason's blood run cold. Something was awake now. Something had noticed them. Mason's hand lingered over the exposed cables, his heart hammering in his chest. The humming from the machinery intensified, resonating in his bones, as if the very walls of Caldwell Manor were alive, pulsing with a hidden energy. A sudden sharp crackle of static shot through the air, followed by a distant whirring sound from the old equipment. Mason's fingers trembled, but he didn't pull away. He had come this far, he couldn't turn back now. Silver's growl vibrated through the air behind him, deep and low. The dog's hackles were raised, eyes wide with fear, as he pawed at the floor, unwilling to go any closer. The terror was clear in his body language. Mason had never seen Silver like this before, and it shook him to his core. "Stay with me, boy," Mason muttered, reaching back to rest a hand on the dog's head. But even as he spoke, the words he knew this wasn't just some normal malfunction or a simple case of overactive imagination. The feeling in the air was suffocating, like they were being drawn into something much larger than they could handle. Suddenly, the machinery crackled louder, and the low humming shifted into a sharp, high-pitched whine. Mason winced, covering his ears, but the noise didn't stop. Instead, it only grew louder, more deafening. The hum felt like it was vibrating through his skull, a violent frequency that set his teeth on edge. Silver's body tensed beside him, his legs shaking. The dog's eyes were locked on the machinery, but Mason could see the pain on his face. Silver's sharp hearing was attuned to frequencies beyond human comprehension, and whatever was coming through that machine was tearing him apart. Mason's stomach turned at the realization the device wasn't just malfunctioning, it was hurting Silver just as it had been from the moment they arrived at Caldwell Manor. With a grim set to his jaw, Mason turned back to the tangled mess of wires and machinery. He had to stop it. For Silver's sake. The hum was now accompanied by a faint clicking noise, as if the machine was recalibrating itself, preparing to send out a signal. Mason's eyes scanned the complex network of devices, his mind working quickly. These machines weren't meant for ordinary use. This was surveillance equipment, possibly military grade. Someone had built this system, and they were watching him watching them. He reached for the nearest exposed wire, but before he could touch it, a loud snap rang out from above, echoing through the dark cellar. Mason froze, every muscle tensing. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, rang out from the floor above. Mason's breath hitched in his chest. Someone else was in the house. Silver's ears flattened against his skull as he let out a low, threatening growl. Mason quickly reached for his flashlight, snapping it on. He moved toward the stairs, feeling the weight of the impending danger pressing in on him. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard. The footsteps above grew louder, closer now, and Mason realized with a sickening certainty that they weren't alone. The figure in the hallway wasn't just some random intruder, it was a hunter, and they were getting closer. Mason moved toward the stairs, but Silver stopped him with a sharp bark, his body stiff and poised to protect. The dog's eyes never left the bottom of the stairs, ears twitching with every sound, every creak in the house. The storm outside had shifted in intensity, but inside Caldwell Manor, the temperature had dropped, the air thickening with every passing second. This isn't just a storm, Mason realized, it's a countdown. A sudden crash from upstairs snapped him from his thoughts. Someone was coming down the stairs. A figure, a silhouette, appeared in the doorway. Mason's heart skipped a beat. The man was tall, lean, wearing tactical gear that seemed out of place in the decaying halls of Caldwell Manor. He stepped forward, his rifle at the ready, scanning the room with a calculated calm. Mason's grip tightened around the flashlight, ready to defend himself, but he couldn't make a move. He couldn't risk Silver's safety. The man's voice rang out low but firm. "You've been snooping around a little too much, old man." Mason's stomach tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. The words felt hollow, forced. He was trapped. The man didn't flinch. He was trained, seasoned. He'd been here before. "Stay where you are," the man commanded, his gaze flicking between Mason and Silver. "The dog stays put and you don't move. You'll wish you hadn't come here." Mason's mind raced. The situation was worse than he had thought. It wasn't just the secrets of the Caldwell family. This man, whoever he was, had been waiting for someone to come looking. And now that Mason had found the truth, he wasn't going to let them leave. Silver growled again, louder this time, the sound like a warning. But Mason could see the dog's legs were shaking. He was in pain, his body betraying him, but there was still fight in those amber eyes. Mason could feel the weight of that gaze on him. Silver wasn't giving up, and neither would he. "What do you want?" Mason asked, his voice, even despite the panic clawing at him from the inside. He didn't have time for games. Not with the storm outside and the danger closing in. "I want you to leave," the man said, his eyes narrowing. He stepped forward, his hand going to the rifle's trigger. "You've stirred up something you don't understand, and now you're going to pay for it." A cold sweat broke out across Mason's brow. He could feel it. The end was coming. And then a flash of movement, a blur of gray and white. Silver launched himself at the intruder with the ferocity of a dog, 10 years younger, teeth, bared eyes wild with pain-fueled determination. The man barely had time to react before Silver's jaws locked onto his arm, dragging him back. Mason's heart raced as he took a step forward, grabbing for the nearest tool on the workbench, anything he could use to defend himself. But the intruder was already struggling to free himself from Silver's grip, his screams filling the air as he tried to shake the dog off. "No," the man yelled, but Silver wasn't letting go. His teeth were locked in a vice-like grip, and he wasn't about to release his hold on Mason's safety. Mason didn't hesitate. He moved in quickly, reaching for the rifle the intruder had dropped. His hand closed around it, and the weight of the weapon grounded him for a moment. The situation had escalated from a search to survival in the blink of an eye. Silver, Mason shouted, "Get back!" But the dog didn't release his hold. Mason pointed the rifle at the man's chest, keeping his aim steady. There was no time to think, only to act. "This ends now," Mason said, his voice low but filled with the weight of 100 decisions made in an instant. The man froze, his body tense with a mix of anger and fear. For a moment, no one moved. The world outside the manor had grown deafeningly quiet, just the crackling of the storm as it battered the windows. Mason's grip on the rifle tightened. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming next, but one thing was certain, he wasn't going to back down. Not for Silver, not for anyone. The tension hung thick in the air, the silence broken only by the storm's fury outside. Mason and Silver were standing on the precipice, facing down the consequences of their choices. The storm inside Caldwell Manor had only just begun, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The air inside the cellar seemed to freeze, a heavy stillness settling between Mason and the intruder as they locked eyes. Silver's growl resonated in Mason's chest like an echo of the past, a warning. The dog's grip on the man's arm didn't loosen despite the intruder's desperate thrashing. There was something different about this moment, something far more dangerous than the looming storm outside. Mason's fingers tightened around the rifle's stock, but his mind was running, spiraling, trying to make sense of the situation. Who was this man? What was this place really hiding? The hidden room, the humming machinery, it was all connected, but the intruder had been waiting for them, for him. Mason couldn't shake the feeling that they had walked into something far bigger than they could have imagined. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard again, not like before. Silver's body trembled with the strain, but his eyes never left the man who now lay flat on his back trying to wriggle free. Mason could see the man's hands reaching for a hidden weapon, but the dog wouldn't let him. The longer Silver held on, the more desperate the man became. His teeth gritted as he roared with frustration, twisting beneath Silver's weight. Mason's mind flashed back to the battlefield, where every decision could mean life or death. The way he had once hesitated to trust his instincts with Duke. The mistake he had made. Not this time. Not again. He wasn't going to lose another partner. "Get off him," Silver, Mason called, his voice sharp but steady. The dog hesitated for only a moment, but Mason's command was enough to break the hold. Silver released his grip, but not without giving the man's arm a final furious snap, a reminder of who was in charge here. The man lay still for a moment, panting with pain and frustration, his eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. Mason stood over him, the rifle still trained on the man. Silver growled low, his fur still bristling, ready to strike again if needed. "What's your name?" Mason demanded, his voice rough from the tension. His mind raced as he tried to piece everything together, but it was clear now this wasn't just an intruder. This man was part of something much bigger. The man didn't answer immediately, still reeling from the pain. His face twisted in anger, but there was something else too, a flicker of recognition. Mason's breath hitched. He knew this man, or at least he had seen someone like him before. "You've been snooping around," the man said through gritted teeth, his voice low and threatening. "You should have left when you had the chance. This place. It's not what you think. It's been watching, waiting for someone like you to stumble in." Mason's grip on the rifle tightened. The storm outside roared louder, but the words hung in the air like a warning. "Watching me," Mason echoed, disbelief rising in his chest. "Who the hell are you, and what is this place really?" The man's lips curled into a smirk, though it was pained. He looked up at Mason, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of contempt and cold calculation. "This house." He began, his voice growing quieter. "It's a prison, not for you, for them." Mason's brow furrowed. For who? The man glanced at Silver, who stood at Mason's side, still tense, watching the intruder with unblinking focus. For the ones who know too much, the ones who dug too deep. Mason's chest tightened. The pieces were starting to click together, but they didn't make sense. There was something more to Caldwell Manor. Something dark that had been buried here long ago. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing as he demanded answers. "Who are you working for?" The man let out a pained laugh, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you?" He coughed, the pain evident in his voice, but the smirk never left. "There's no one left to stop this. The family's gone, but what they built, it never dies. You've already triggered it. You've already set it off." Mason's heart skipped a beat. Set what off? The man's eyes glinted with something Mason couldn't quite place. "The signal. The trap. It's activated. And now you're a part of it." Mason took a step back, the weight of the man's words sinking in. Set off. The humming machinery, the secret room in the cellar, the cameras hidden throughout the house, it was all starting to feel like a carefully orchestrated nightmare. "No," Mason muttered, shaking his head. "No, this wasn't part of the deal. I'm here for Silver's surgery. That's it." The man chuckled darkly, a laugh that carried no humor. "You think you're just some old man taking care of a broken dog. You're in over your head, Ford. You don't get to walk away from this." His voice was dripping with venom now. "You're in the middle of something far bigger than you realize. The house has its eyes on you, and now there's no turning back. Once you've activated the signal, it's already started. They'll come for you." Mason's mind reeled, but something in the man's words clicked. He was talking about them, whoever they were. The ones watching, pulling the strings from the shadows. This wasn't just about Caldwell Manor. This was about something far larger, more dangerous. Mason took another step back, his mind racing. The situation had spiraled out of control. What had seemed like a simple job, a quiet place to heal, Silver had turned into a living nightmare, and now they were trapped in it. Silver's growl broke Mason's thoughts. He turned to find the dog's eyes locked on the man, watching him closely. The dog knew what Mason had just realized. They weren't alone anymore. Whatever game Caldwell Manor was playing, it wasn't one that Mason had agreed to. But now he was trapped in it, just like everyone else. Mason turned back to the intruder, his eyes hardening. "So what happens now?" he demanded, his voice low, but filled with determination. "What are you going to do?" the man sneered. "You're asking the wrong question. The question is, what are they going to do? Because they're coming. They've been waiting for you. And when they arrive..." Mason's gut twisted as the man's voice trailed off. The storm outside seemed to reach its peak as a loud crash echoed through the manor. The storm had stopped feeling like just wind and snow. It was the sound of something worse, something closing in. The intruder shifted, his body tense like a predator preparing for the final strike. "And when they arrive, you'll be the one they want." The chilling weight of the intruder's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Something had been activated, something Mason had never expected. Caldwell Manor was no longer just an old house with a dark past. It was now a battleground, and they were about to face its wrath. Mason's pulse pounded in his ears as the intruder scrambled, his arm still caught in Silver's unyielding grip. Silver, the old dog who had seen more battles than most men ever, would held the man down with a sheer strength born from years of training and loyalty. The intruder, his face contorted in pain and anger, tried to wriggle free, but there was no escape. Silver's jaws were locked tight, and Mason wasn't about to let up. "You're done," Mason said, his voice low and dangerous. His hand tightened around the rifle, its weight suddenly feeling lighter than it had before. Silver's growl intensified as the man tried to shake him off, but the dog's hold was unwavering. The intruder's body writhed beneath him, but the dog was firm, as steadfast as the day they had first met. Mason could feel the tension in the air, thick, oppressive, and electric. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. This had become a fight for the truth, for everything he'd come here to uncover. The intruder's eyes narrowed in frustration. "You don't know what you've done," he snarled, his breath ragged from the struggle. "You don't get it. You can't stop what's coming. The house is alive. The storm is just the beginning. They're already on their way." Mason's mind was a whirlwind. The house is alive. What did that even mean? The storm outside had escalated into a force of nature, but this felt different. There was something deeper at play here. Something far more insidious than weather patterns or faulty machinery. The storm outside wasn't just the wind, it was the harbinger of something darker, something Mason hadn't even begun to understand. And now the intruder was talking about them, whoever they were, as if they were coming for him in silver now. A sharp crack of thunder outside the manor made the walls shudder. The storm was building, but it wasn't just the wind that was causing the tremors. Mason stepped back, trying to get a clearer view of the intruder's face. He could feel the weight of the man's words creeping under his skin, settling into the pit of his stomach. There was more to this place than just the isolation and the rot. The walls of Caldwell Manor were hiding something, and now they were about to make sure Mason never found out. "Who are they?" Mason demanded, his voice steady despite the rising panic. "Who is coming for me?" The intruder let out a dark, humorless chuckle, the pain in his eyes giving way to something else, something colder. "You really want to know, Ford? You really think you've got the stomach for it?" Mason didn't hesitate. He wasn't going to back down from this. He didn't care what the intruder had to say or how bad it got. He would get the answers. He had to. The man's lips curled into a twisted smile. "Fine. I'll tell you," he said, his words dripping with venom. "They've been waiting for a fool like you to walk in. Someone who could set off the signal, who could reactivate the system. Someone like you. And now that you've triggered it, they'll come. They'll destroy everything." Mason's stomach twisted. "Who are they?" he repeated, his voice firmer now. The intruder's eyes darkened his face, a mask of disdain and fear. "You've never heard of the Caldwell Consortium, have you?" His voice dropped to a whisper, almost as if saying the name aloud was too dangerous. "The family doesn't just collect antiques and power, they collect secrets. Things they shouldn't have. And this house? It's a repository. A vault." All of this, the intruder gestured wildly at the decaying mansion, was built to house the things they've been hiding from the world. "The signal you've triggered," he stopped, his eyes darting towards Silver. "It's been set up to broadcast across the country. And when it's activated, they'll come. They'll silence you. Silence everything." Mason's head was spinning. The Caldwell Consortium, a vault, the things they'd been hiding. He couldn't even begin to understand what the man was talking about. And yet he knew one thing for sure: Caldwell Manor was no ordinary house. It was a machine, a trap. The intruder laughed bitterly. "You don't even know the half of it, Ford. You're walking into the lion's den, and the lions don't take kindly to strangers." Mason's eyes narrowed. The man wasn't just talking about the storm. He was talking about something bigger, something that went beyond the estate's rotting walls. The house was part of something much larger, a system, and now it had Mason in its grip. Suddenly the whir of the machinery in the basement grew louder, an unmistakable hum that echoed throughout the manor. It was as if the house itself had begun to respond to the conversation, to the very words spoken in the air. Silver growled again, his hackles raised ears flattened against his head. The dog had sensed it before Mason could. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was a battle to shut down something that had been waiting far longer than Mason ever could have imagined. Before Mason could react, another sound filled the air, a loud, shrill screech from the walls. The hum intensified, rising to an unbearable pitch. Mason stumbled back, instinctively reaching for Silver. He could feel the house shifting beneath him, vibrating like a live wire. And then he heard its footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from the hallway. The intruder's eyes widened in alarm, and suddenly the fear in his expression shifted into something else, a knowing, cold fear. "They're here," he whispered. Mason barely had time to process the words before the sound of boots against marble echoed in the hallway. This wasn't just the storm anymore. They were coming. The front door of the manor burst open with a violent crack, the hinges protesting as the wind pushed through. The silhouette of men, clad in dark tactical gear, filled the doorway, their silhouettes sharp against the dim light spilling in from the outside. The storm had intensified beyond anything Mason had experienced, but now the true danger had arrived. The first man in the doorway raised his rifle, scanning the room. His eyes locked onto Mason, narrowing with cold precision. "Mason Ford," the man said, his voice low but filled with authority. "I'm afraid you've overstayed your welcome." Silver's growl escalated to a full-on snarl. He pushed forward, still weak but determined to protect his partner. Mason reached out, steadying the dog with one hand while keeping his other on the rifle. His fingers tightened around the stock. "Stay back," Silver Mason muttered, his eyes never leaving the intruders. He wasn't about to let them take his dog or him without a fight. The men moved in methodical and cold, but they hadn't expected Silver to react with such speed. The first man took a step forward, and before Mason could stop him, Silver lunged. The attack was swift. Silver's jaws locked onto the man's leg, pulling him down with an explosive force. The man's scream echoed through the room as he collapsed, his rifle clattering to the floor. The second man reacted immediately, raising his weapon, but Mason was already moving. His military instincts kicked in, and in one fluid motion he pulled the rifle from his shoulder, aiming straight at the second man. "Drop it," Mason shouted, his voice hoarse with adrenaline. The second man froze his finger, hovering above the trigger. His eyes flicked from Mason to the struggling intruder on the floor, Silver still clamped onto his leg. The man's gaze hardened. "You think you can stop us?" The second man spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "This house, this whole operation, it's bigger than you. You'll never get out of here alive." Mason's heart pounded in his chest. They weren't just here to silence him, they were here to finish something that had started long before his arrival. And now Mason was trapped in the center of it all. The whir of the machinery grew louder as the second man took a step back, his rifle still aimed at Mason. But before Mason could make his next move, the first man, still on the ground, his leg bleeding heavily, managed to pull a knife from his boot. He lunged, trying to take Mason by surprise. But Silver was faster. With a low guttural bark, the dog released his hold on the man's leg and launched himself onto the intruder's chest, knocking him backward. The man's knife skittered across the floor, and Silver clamped down on his wrist with a snarl, forcing him to drop it. Mason's rifle was aimed now, the intruder in his sights. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the room, and the man went limp beneath Silver's weight. Silver didn't let go. Mason's breath hitched as he dropped the rifle to the floor, his knees buckling beneath him. The battle was over, but the storm still raged outside. The mansion groaned in protest, but Mason knew the real fight was just beginning. The house wasn't just a building anymore. It had become a battleground, a prison that had been waiting for them both. Mason knelt beside Silver, his fingers running through the dog's fur. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. The manor stood still, its secrets exposed for all to see. The storm outside howled, but inside the tension had reached its peak. Mason's mind raced as he realized the full scope of what he had just uncovered. Caldwell Manor was no ordinary house. It was a weapon, and its power had just been unleashed. The storm outside had started to lose its intensity, though the wind still whipped through the cracks of Caldwell Manor like a whisper of something far darker. The house had quieted for the moment, the screams and the chaos ebbing into the silence of the aftermath. Mason stood at the center of the room, his back pressed against the cold stone wall, his breath-shallow heart still racing. Silver, despite the exhaustion, stayed at his side, his eyes soft yet vigilant. He leaned into Mason, sensing the moment. The dog's breathing was slow but steady, the tension of the fight melting away with the passing minutes. But Mason knew there was still work to be done, so much more. The house, once a gilded monument of power, now felt hollow. The walls that had held centuries of secrets now stood exposed, and the machinery Mason had destroyed only seemed to be the beginning of the battle. He could feel the weight of the intruder's final words, the warning that someone or something was still out there watching them. The house wasn't done with them yet, but for the first time in a long while, Mason didn't feel the urgency to run. The storm, both outside and within, had brought him to the brink, but here he stood unchanged, anchored and resolute. He had faced down the ghosts of his past, those moments that haunted him, the misstep in the desert with Duke, the men he had lost, the guilt that had followed him for years. All those pieces of him scattered across decades had come to a head in this house. But now it was different. Now he wasn't running. He had nothing left to prove. Silver had given him that. His old partner had reminded him of what loyalty truly meant, not just in the way they fought side by side, but in the quiet moments, the ones when there was no one else. The dog had never abandoned him, even when the world seemed to close in, even when Mason couldn't see the way forward. And now Silver needed him more than ever. But Mason wasn't the same man he had been when he first arrived. He had walked into this house with one goal: to protect Silver, to pay the debts of the past, but now he understood. He was here to end something. The house, its secrets, the machinery, it all had to end. And as long as he had Silver by his side, he would fight until it did. Mason looked out at the stillness of the manor, its long, empty corridors stretching out before him. The house had been built on power and secrets, on silencing those who knew too much. But Mason had learned a different lesson. He didn't need to hide, and he wasn't afraid anymore. What mattered was who he had left, what remained. And that was Silver. The storm outside had passed, leaving a quiet, brittle calm in its wake. The world beyond Caldwell Manor would continue, but Mason and Silver had forged a bond here that could not be broken, a trust built through years of loyalty. "Let's go home," Buddy Mason whispered, his voice soft but certain. He didn't have the answers yet, but he knew this much: they had made it through the longest night, and whatever came next, they would face it together. As he helped Silver to his feet, and they walked toward the front door, Mason cast one last look at the manor, a place of secrets and shadows, and stepped into the light of the new day. They had survived, together,